Hello there, and welcome to my session today on differentiation or adaptation. What's the difference? So, my name's Paige Larkin, and I'm one of the deputy head teachers at Reading Valley High School. And the subject that I teach and still very much love is history. And some of the session aims then that I do want to share before I get started is, first of all, I do want to recap the difference between the two terms that are on the screen. I say recap because I know that I did a session similar to this theme last academic year. So you may have been in a session like this one about those two terms, adaptation and differentiation. So I don't want to go on too much about the difference in the language, but I would like to recap that because I think it's really important to do what I would really like to do today, which is to begin to develop a CLP scaffolding toolkit, which right from the get-go, as soon as I started off this think tank, that was something that I thought we could really benefit from as a trust, and we could benefit from talking about at the very least as well. So first things first then, I would like to reshare my inquiry question that I was working on as think tank lead all of last academic year. So my question was, to what extent does our trust have a shared and effective understanding of differentiation, and how is this executed in our classroom? So that was my question. That was something that I went on and did a bit of investigation around, did a bit of reading and research around, and obviously the sort of fruits of that labour hopefully will become apparent in this session. So that was my area of focus then. So I have showed this on the screen previously, another session, but I would just like to remind everyone that the people that worked in my think tank helped me put this together. So we essentially did a bit of a SWOT analysis on where we were at in regards to differentiation as a trust. And I essentially just asked people to tell me what they think the strengths are when it comes to differentiation in their school, what the weaknesses were, and what opportunities we had as a trust and as individual schools, and what threats we saw as individual schools as well. And you can see there that one of the key strengths was this idea about having a focus on teaching to the top. And I know that that phrase, that sort of language is definitely something that's quite common across the trust. It is pretty much shared. And I thought that was a real strength, really. So you can see there's lots of things on there, and I'm not going to read every single one of them because I don't really think it's appropriate to at this stage. And also, like I said, I did share this previously in the session last academic year. So this is what I started with, and it helped me really move forward with what I think we should do, using those weaknesses, using those threats, and of course using those opportunities to help guide me with these next steps. So my first task then, really, and there are going to be quite a few tasks in today's session, is all about the language to start off with. And it is going to be quite a quick one because, as I said, I know we've covered this previously. So I've got two terms on the screen. I've got term one, which is differentiation, and term two, which is adaptation. And what I'd like people to do, I'd first of all like us to think, pause for a moment and actually think about these two words. And I would like you to write down on your post-it notes that you should have in front of you. Hopefully you've got quite a few post-it notes in front of you. And I would like you to write down on each one of them, so using two separate ones, first of all, how you would define the term differentiation. And second of all, how would you define the term adaptation? If you can as well, I would quite like it if you could give me an example of each of the terms, so an actual real life example, either in one of the lessons that you've taught recently or one that you've got coming up, so that you can actually bring those two terms to life, okay? So what I'd like you to do is I would like you to pause me now for 5 minutes exactly. And for those 5 minutes, we're going to pause, we're going to think, we're going to write down two terms with hopefully two examples and one for each. And then I would like your facilitator to bring all those answers back and see where we're at the moment with those two terms. So please pause me now. So hopefully then you guys have had a good chat about what those two terms mean, or what you think they mean, and hopefully we've got a bit of common ground forming. So obviously now it's my job to share some definitions around these terms, and also share with you where I got these definitions from, of course. So first of all, differentiation then, what does it mean? Differentiation asks teachers to plan different tasks or learning experiences for different groups of students, with the idea being that we can better meet the needs of diverse learners. So, for example, if we had our high student, our medium student, and our low performing student, we might provide a different text for each one in order to ensure that they would be reading something at their level. Okay, so there's a definition of differentiation. It comes from an article that we're going to have a look at later, so I won't give you the exact reference, but it does come from a piece of reading that we're going to come on to in a moment. So have a bit of a think about that definition on the screen there. Obviously, the word different comes up a fair few times, and we've also got an example with this definition as well about the high, medium, and low performing students being given different texts in order to ensure that they'd be reading something at their level. So potentially a bit of an English example, maybe another subject where we're doing some reading. Okay, so that's differentiation. And what about adaptation? And I thought I'd give you a couple of different definitions for this one. So first of all, we can call it adapting teaching in a responsive way, including by providing targeted support to students to increase pupil success. I've also got this one that comes from the Ambition Institute. So the one above, sorry, comes from Understanding Adaptive Teaching from Kingsbridge Research School. This one comes from the Ambition Institute, a really well-known training provider that lots of you may have done your either early careers framework with, or maybe you've done an NPQ with one of these, or one of those qualifications with the Ambition Institute. And this is what they have to say about adaptive teaching. So they say adaptive teaching is less likely to be valuable if it causes the teacher to artificially create distinct tasks for different groups of pupils, or to set lower expectations for particular pupils. There is a common misconception that pupils have distinct and identifiable learning styles. This is not supported by evidence, and attempting to tailor lessons to learning style is unlikely to be beneficial. Now, the reason I showed you that definition, because actually they've given you like a reverse definition, haven't they? They've actually told you what adaptation isn't. They've said that it isn't something where a teacher sets different tasks for different types of students, and therefore that would set that lower expectation. So obviously with that, if we flip that around, it's not about, so adaptive teaching isn't about providing lots of different tasks for the same end goal. And it's not about lowering your expectations, about keeping that expectation high. So I'll be honest, it doesn't really give you the most concrete definition of adaptive teaching. And if you go out there and do a Google search, or you do a little bit of reading, it's actually quite hard to pin down a sort of nailed down definition of the term adaptive teaching. And after doing quite a lot of research on this, I think it's because the term implies lots of different strategies rather than giving you an actual definitive answer. So all the stuff that I've read points towards the word scaffolding. So it says that adaptive teaching is the sort of umbrella term that we use because we are adapting our teaching slightly, we're manoeuvring things slightly, to enable students to be able to reach sort of goals that are high. But to get there, we use scaffolding. And I know that we are very familiar, or should be really familiar, with the term scaffolding. It's something that we obviously use as a big part of our teach to the top and scaffold down principle. So we've got to try and think now about how we actually move forward with these two terms, because they do seem to be pretty clashing, really. So my question is this: does the term differentiation support the CLP's trust ethos of teaching to the top? So with everything that I've just said there, and with everything you guys have probably spoken about with your definitions of those two terms, does the term differentiation, it's a big part of our ACE framework, it's the D in our ACE framework, and I know lots of other schools have slightly different terms, or they might have used a slightly different acronym, but that word differentiation sits as a real key part of our ACE framework. So does it support our ethos of teaching to the top? Well, I was going to get us all to have a conversation about this, but you can see from my Kermit the Frog picture there, no, I don't think it does. I think if we're really honest with ourselves and we think, well, what is teaching to the top? It is making sure that our lesson is pitched high, that it is challenging, it's pushing our students, and it's actually believing in them. It's setting really high expectations. And if we go about giving students different things to do, that's actually like sort of a contradiction, isn't it, to what we mean by teaching to the top. And actually, that term adaptive teaching fits way better with where we want to be. We all recognise that for every single student sat in front of us, whether they are from a pupil premium background, whether they're from a SEND background, whether they're from a sort of old school gifted and talented background, no matter what background they're from, no matter what ability profile they've got, we know that we want to have really high expectations of all the students sat in front of us, and we want to give them the best quality education they can get. And we don't want to give anyone a sort of watered down version of a curriculum. But what I will say, and I do have quite a big disclaimer at this point though, and I spoke to my Senko, Tony Taylor, a lot about this when I was talking to him about this think tank. What I will say is I'm proposing, and I think you can catch my drift now, that we adopt the term adaptation because it fits so much better within our ethos of teaching to the top. It fits in perfectly with this idea of scaffolding and how we use that to support our students that are struggling. But what I would really like to say though is that for our SEND students, for those students with an EHCP, for any students that have very specific needs and very specific strategies attached to those needs, what I don't want anyone to take away from this is that we don't necessarily do things differently for them if it is specified that they need it for that need. So, for example, if you have a student that needs different coloured paper to be able to access the curriculum, or if you have a student that needs a particular font size, or whatever that might be, what I'm not saying here by moving towards this term adaptation is that you don't do that. I think we all know, don't we, that there are specific cases for students where they will need a different approach. But I think in the main, when it comes to our classroom, when it comes to our students sat in front of us, adaptive teaching fits in massively with this mantra of teach to the top that I know that we all very much stand by when it comes to wanting the best from our students. So I also wanted to touch on what the early career framework states as well. I thought it was really important to get this in here. So we all know our early career framework is something the government introduced a couple of years ago now. It only seems like yesterday, but it's been with us for a couple of years. And it's obviously the way that we train our new teachers. It's the way that we induct them into our schools, and it's a process, a pretty big process now over 2 years that our new teachers will become a part of. And just to flag this with everybody, the term adaptive teaching is in that early careers framework. Okay, they don't actually go with the term differentiation anymore. And they've gone with this term. And I just put a screenshot on the screen here from the standards linked to the early careers framework from the Department of Education. And you can see here, it's just a little screenshot about all the things that as a teacher we should learn to do when it comes to adaptive teaching, and all the things that we should try and put into practice. So I'm not going to say let's all sit here and read this, but I would like to flag it. And if you would like to access it at some point, it's really, really easy. If you just Google Early Careers Framework Adaptive Teaching, and you'll see all the information on this. It's also quite key to note that our new teachers, this is not a new term to them. And in fact, it is something that obviously, as you can see, the sort of teaching world is going with, and it's moving towards the use of this term as a big move. So I would like us to have a little read now. And the article that I would like you to read is the one that hopefully your facilitators have left on your tables for you. I'm not going to put it on the screen because I'd just rather everyone just have their own copy in front of them rather than squinting at the screen. So what I'd like people to do is obviously read the article. I would say you probably need 5 minutes to read it. It's not very long. I didn't want to give you loads of reading. And I've got 2 discussion questions that I would like people to talk about in their groups. So the first question is this: what are the benefits of such a language shift? So from what you can read, what do you think as a teacher, as a member of support staff, whatever role you take in the school, what do you think the benefits are of such a language shift? What do you think we're going to gain from this? How do you think it aligns with our ethos? Talk me through the benefits. And then the second thing I would like us to discuss, because there's no point in sitting here and thinking, yeah, it's all hunky dory, let's just move to the term adaptive teaching without even thinking about it. What issues do you think we could face by potentially going with this language shift? I sort of already told you one, didn't I, a moment ago, my little disclaimer. So if you'd like to talk a little bit more about that as well, that would be brilliant. And the reason I'm also getting you to do this is because when I originally had the conversation around language with the think tank, a couple of people raised some really good points about the term differentiation, and I would quite like people to air those thoughts and those comments, because I think it's really important to do so. So please pause me for 10 minutes, 5 to do the reading, 5 to do the discussion. Thank you very much. So hopefully everybody has had a good chance to read that article and talk about the benefits and the issues. And yeah, I mean, obviously I'm not there in real life, so I can't take feedback from you, but hopefully your facilitators have gathered some feedback and really had a think about this language shift. And I'm hoping that you could see from reading that article, you've got the two little diagrams on there of the difference between differentiation, the difference between scaffolding, and I thought they were really visual, nice ways of understanding those two terms. The article itself doesn't necessarily reference adaptation as the key language. It talks about scaffolding, but I see scaffolding as the tool that you use to adapt your teaching. Obviously, they've just jumped straight to that term, scaffolding. Okay, so another little bit of a task now, but this one involves having a think, talking, and then sharing back with the group. So I thought this is a really important task. So we can probably all agree, after having a little look at the reading and obviously from the stuff that I presented in the last session, last academic year, that adaptive teaching is great, but can only work when. So I want you to finish that sentence, and I want you to come up with as many answers as possible. So adaptive teaching is great, but only can work when ... Okay, so guys, pause me now for 5 minutes while you finish that sentence. Okay, so hopefully you guys came up with some good answers, and I thought what I'd do for this one is give you some of my thoughts on this. So my big thing here is adaptive teaching is great, being able to on the spot, in the moment, change some of the language that you're using in your lesson, offer an alternative way of doing something, give some scaffolding, whatever it is that you're doing to adapt your teaching is brilliant. But in my opinion, you can only do that when you've used effective AFL. Okay, when you actually know what to do my class understand and what do they not understand, both from a whole class point of view, because you can do scaffolding on a whole class level, or from an individual point of view. So you're not going to know that unless you've used effective AFL. That can either be formal or informal, whatever you've decided to do, whether it's you've done a quiz on whiteboards, whether you've actually taken in a set of essays to mock, whatever it is that you've done, you must know, what am I helping students with? If you don't know what you're helping them with, then how can you effectively adapt and scaffold in that moment? Okay. I also think it's absolutely crucial, and this goes without saying, really, doesn't it, that you understand the individual needs of the students in your class. Again, how can you adapt for the class that are sat in front of you if you don't know them? It's going to be really, really hard. Now, if you've only just taken on a group, obviously that can take weeks to actually get to know them properly. But once you do know them and you know the needs of the students in front of you, then obviously adaptive teaching can happen then, but only when you know your kids. I also think adaptive teaching is great, but only when your lesson has been pitched high. If it's pitched right down here, then you're not going to need to adapt anyway, because it's too easy and everyone's flying through the lesson and you sort of like, oh, this is brilliant. Everyone's having a great time. We all know, don't we, that we're only really learning when we're actually being challenged properly, sufficiently. Maybe I should use that word instead. And actually, if our lesson is an absolute doddle and it's a walk in the park, then you're not going to need to adapt your teaching anyway. So really, really important that we understand that as well. And I also said as well that adaptive teaching is great, but can only work when scaffolding techniques that you use to adapt are effective and applicable in that moment. But we'll talk about techniques in a moment though. Okay, so for me, they were the things that I thought had to be in place, that you had to consider. And that top one is so crucial, and it's actually easier said than done, isn't it? AFL itself is a massive thing that we're always needing to talk about. There's plenty of things you can do to test whether or not your students do understand what you've taught them, but whether it's effective or not is a different kettle of fish altogether. Okay, but I do think that these things really, really must be there before we adapt our teaching. And maybe this is why so many, and I put myself in this category, by the way, maybe this is why so many, newer teachers, sort of less experienced teachers, maybe it's why that idea of adapting your teaching is quite hard. I always found it really hard. When I trained, we used the word differentiation, and I always found it really overwhelming. I remember when I was doing my teacher standards folder and having to sort of think of evidence to go in the differentiation standard. I always found it really tricky, and I always thought, I don't think I'm doing this properly. And maybe it is so hard because there's so many other things that have to be working for you to be able to adapt your teaching effectively and scaffold for the needs in your class. Okay. I also think I probably found it hard though, is because I was taught to produce, sometimes 5 or 6 different resources for the 5 or 6 different needs in my class. And obviously that in itself is really, really challenging if you're teaching 5 lessons a day. So maybe that's another reason why I found it so tricky as well. So moving forward then, what should we do with all this information? What are we going to do as a trust? Well, first of all, I do want to show you that Roding Valley has gone with the language shift. And this year we decided to rephrase the differentiation strand in our ACE mastery booklet. And we've gone with a little A and then a big D, so we can keep in the D in the ACE framework. Adaptive teaching, as you can see there in the yellow jigsaw piece puzzle. And you can see a little screenshot of our adaptive teaching page where we always go on with what the purpose of the strand is and then what the strategies are that we can use to adapt our teaching. So if you did want to have a little look at the copy of our ACE mastery booklet, then I did drop a link in to your facilitators, so they've got that in their email if they want to forward that to you. And it is on our website as well. So I think the language shift is a must, really, based on the research, based on the evidence. And I haven't gone on too much about evidence today because I felt like I did that in the last session, and I didn't want to repeat lots of things and repeat lots of reading as well. But the EEF, if you're yet to be convinced, then please do visit the EEF. They've done a whole thing on adaptive teaching as well. So the language shift, I think, comes first. That then is obviously in your mastery guide, in whatever you sort of publicise your ACE framework in, so that all teachers, no matter at what stage they are in their career, if they're just walking through the door for the first time or they've been in your school for sort of 20, 30 years, everyone knows that this is the term that we use because it fits so much better in with our principles of scaffolding and teaching to the top. Okay. And then I think it's important to actually have some tools up your sleeve. So if we say we adapt our teaching, well, how? What do we actually do? We can talk the talk, but can we actually walk the walk? And I sort of made myself do this task, and I actually found it quite hard, but I found it really worthwhile to think about it. So what I'd like everyone to do is, and this works better, by the way, if you are in your subject or phase or key stage teams. So if you do need to move to those groups, please do. I think it works so much better if you're sat with people that either teach the same key stage, the same phase, the same subject as you. I think it works so much better. So the first thing I want us to do is collect as many strategies that you use to scaffold in the moment. So what do you do in the moment during your teaching that you've not pre-planned, that you're just doing to respond to the learners in front of you when they don't understand something or they're finding something really, really hard? How do you scaffold? How do you provide support to be able to get them to those high expectations? Okay. And my second thing that I want us to have a think about, and try and write as many of these down as well, is what can you do to scaffold during the planning stages? So when you're sat there planning your lesson, it might be when you're driving to work in your car and you're thinking about a brilliant lesson that you're going to do in a few weeks' time. And you're thinking, oh, what am I going to do here? Or maybe when you sat down with a teacher that you share the year group with, or you sat down with your subject lead, whatever you're doing to plan. What can you then do in the planning stages to offer that support? Now, that one's obviously much harder because you're preempting what students might find difficult, but obviously as subject specialists, it's something that we should be able to do. So this is a bit of a longer task. Now, for this one, again, you should have a few post-it notes knocking around. Divide them into scaffolding in the moment, scaffolding during the planning stages, and I want you to think, write as many different strategies on different post-it notes, as many as you can. Okay, the facilitator you've got with you will then stop, collect these in, stick them onto the screen, and then you can start to hopefully see if there are any common themes in your school with how you scaffold in the moment and how you scaffold during the planning stages. Okay, so for this one, you're going to need 10 minutes. So 10 minutes, pause me now. Okay, brilliant. So hopefully you found that a worthwhile task. I thought I'd share my answers with you as well. I thought it's only fair that I share what I came up with too. And I had to think to myself, and I thought, well, I'm going to do this from a history point of view, from a historian's point of view. And this is what I do in the moment. So I do a lot of reminding students about definitions of keywords. And I do this via lots of like retrieval questioning. So let's say they're doing a task about, let's go with the Anglo-Saxon monarchy. And they're doing a question about why Anglo-Saxon monarchs were so powerful. And I really want them to talk about, let's go with minting, the minting of coins, the production of coins. And I really want them to use that word minting. And I'd really have to pull that word out of some of my students who wouldn't necessarily be able to think of that on the spot. And I'd remind them through lots of retrieval-based questioning in that moment to try and bring that word to the forefront so they can use that in their answer. Whereas lots of students in there will just get that. They'll just be able to get the pen to paper straight away and start giving me a really good answer on this. Whereas other students are going to need me to remind them verbally through retrieval-based questioning to bring those key words to the forefront. I also do lots of writing sentence starters in the moment. I think that's so powerful. I do like pre-prepared ones as well, but sometimes you just don't know what they're going to struggle with. You can only do that when you've walked around the class. If you're not walking around, if you're not circulating, if you're not looking at what kids are doing, you're not going to know what they're struggling with. So when I hover and I have a lean over someone's shoulder and I think, whoa, they don't know how to start the counter argument, or they don't know how to start the conclusion, I can stop. I can say, right, if you're struggling with the conclusion, we could start like this. And I physically write this out on the board nice and slowly so they can see my chain of thought, so they can see what I'm thinking. I think that's so powerful. Dual coding, I think, is really powerful. If you've asked a student to create a flow chart on the order of historical events, and you've got some students sat there and they're really, really, really struggling, again, start using images on the screen, draw them yourself, get them on Google Images up there so you can bring back to life memories of that chronology. Annotation of texts, rather than saying, here's a text, let's read it, let's annotate it together first. That's so powerful in the moment. Put the text under the visualizer, draw attention to key words. Again, it's great. It brings all these things together. And my favorite one is it's like teacher talk using metacognition. Show them what you're thinking, tell them what you're thinking. If you're doing exam questions together, look at the exam question and actually talk them through what your brain is saying about that exam question. It's so powerful. They're going to need to know how to do that, and it really, really supports students who don't know how to start and don't know what to do. Obviously, you've got plenty of scaffolding during the planning stages as well, which is really important. And I think that's a brilliant one, that obviously if you've got the time to do it, that you can think about it in advance. So things like supplementary questions that you can drop into your PowerPoints that support the bigger inquiry question, that are a bit like stepping stones along the way. You can also use structure strips. They're absolutely brilliant as well. Obviously, you need to pre-plan those so that when students are writing essays, they can be along the margins. They can follow those as they go. They can be specific to your subject, specific to set questions.